ever stopped to think how a policy decision in one country can, well, completely reshape the economic landscape of an entire continent? Today, we're taking a deep dive into precisely that. The economic fallout in Africa from Donald Trump's America First trade policies, specifically the tariffs that were put in place.
And we've got quite a stack of policy reports, economic data, strategic analyses that we've really sifted through to try and understand how these tariffs altered the course of trade for African nations. Our goal isn't just like a surface look, but to give you a clear picture of the intricate ways these policies had an impact and maybe what the long-term implications might be.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because when we talk about these changes, we're mainly looking at two kinds of tariffs.
That's right.
First, the Section 232 tariffs. Those targeted steel, aluminum, and later even autos, and they were justified by the idea of national security.
Yep. And then you had the so-called reciprocal tariffs, which began with a standard 10% on pretty much everything imported into the U.S., but with the potential for much higher rates, depending on the specific country.
And the scale here is really something, isn't it?
It really is important to grasp. A significant majority of African nations, I think it was 51 out of 53 to be exact, found themselves facing these new duties.
Wow.
This wasn't just a minor tweak. It was a really widespread shift in how trade worked.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think, because all of this happened right when a really crucial trade agreement was already in place. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA.
Exactly, AGOA.
And we're going to explore how these tariffs actually ended up, well, undermining the very benefits that AGOA was designed to create.
Yeah, to really get the impact, you first need to look at the broader shift in U.S. trade policy. The America First doctrine, it marked a real departure from, decades of promoting free market globalization.
Yeah, a big shift.
Huge. This new perspective sort of operated under a zero-sum view, meaning the U.S. increasingly saw any economic gain by another country through trade as like a direct loss for the U.S.
Which is quite different from the idea that trade can be mutually beneficial.
It's completely different, a significant change.
So what was the core thinking, the rationale behind imposing these tariffs then?
Well, the reasoning was complex. For sectors like steel, aluminum, maybe critical minerals, the main justification often circled back to national security, the idea that relying less on foreign suppliers was vital.
Okay.
For other types of goods, the tariffs aimed to address what the U.S. administration considered unfair trade practices, and also, importantly, to reduce the country's substantial trade deficit.
Right. The underlying goal was to try and bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., revitalize American industry, put America first.
Exactly.
And we're focusing on a particular period here, aren't we, for this analysis?
Yeah, exactly. Our analysis mostly covers the years between 2017 and 2021, when these policies were really being actively put into effect.
Yeah, got it.
But it's worth noting that some policy documents and future projections do look further out, with 2025 often mentioned as a key year for seeing the full effects play out.
And when we talk about the impact on Africa, it's crucial to remember it's not like one single block, right?
Yeah.
We need to look at some specific economies.
Absolutely. You really need to look at individual countries. Major players like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, they offer really valuable examples of the diverse ways these tariffs played out across the continent.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics then. First, those Section 232 tariffs.
Right.
Steel and aluminum were the initial targets back in 2018, hitting them with a pretty significant 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, all based on that national security argument.
Yeah, the argument being that strong domestic production of these materials is essential for, military readiness, infrastructure security, reducing reliance on potentially unreliable foreign suppliers.
And what's interesting here is that this policy wasn't static, right? It evolved.
Not at all. By 2025, there were plans floated to broaden it to include downstream products made from steel and aluminum. And the tariff on aluminum itself was actually scheduled to increase, potentially up to 25%.
Wow, matching steel.
Yeah. And furthermore, many of the country-specific and product exemptions that had been granted initially, they were later revoked, which really widened the net of the tariffs.
And it didn't stop with just metals, did it? There was also that 25% tariff slapped on imported automobiles and auto parts.
Correct. Again, national security was cited.
Okay.
This time, the focus was on the importance of having a healthy domestic auto manufacturing base. The rationale was that a robust domestic industrial base, including automaking, was vital.
Got it. Now let's shift gears to these reciprocal tariffs. This sounds like it had an even broader reach.
It certainly did.
Yeah.
In April 2025, the announcement came. a universal 10% baseline tariff on almost all goods entering the U.S., and it was set to take effect quite quickly.
But wait, it wasn't just a flat 10% for everyone, was it?
Precisely. That's the key. There were also higher country-specific tariffs announced. These ranged from 11% all the way up to a pretty substantial 50%.
50%.
Yeah. These targeted 57 countries that the U.S. had identified as having significant trade deficits with it. Now, initially, these higher rates were suspended for 90 days for most countries.
Okay.
But China was a notable exception. They faced them immediately.
So the justification here wasn't about, say, specific unfair practices, but more about the overall balance of trade itself. That seems like a fundamentally different economic approach, doesn't it?
It really does. And it raises an important question about the underlying economic rationale. Many economists found justifying tariffs based solely on trade deficits to be, well, contentious.
A bit simplistic, maybe.
Perhaps. It arguably overlooks the really complex web of factors that actually influence trade flows between countries.
Okay, so how did this all play out for Africa then? Were most countries hit with that initial 10% or the higher rates?
The vast majority were affected. Like we said, only Burkina Faso and Seychelles were spared entirely. 29 African nations faced that 10% baseline.
Okay.
While a significant 22 countries were hit with those higher country-specific tariffs, with some reaching that maximum of 50%.
Were there any, broad categories of goods that were exempt? Anything offering some relief?
Yes, there were. Certain product categories were exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. These included steel and aluminum.
Right, because they were already covered by 232.
Exactly. Other exemptions included copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, bullion, and crucially, energy products, including crude oil.
Okay, so for major oil producers like Nigeria and Angola, that sounds like it could have offered some protection from these reciprocal tariffs.
It did, from the reciprocal ones specifically.
But it wasn't quite that simple overall, was it?
Not at all. It's really crucial to remember two things. First, those exemptions did not extend to the Section 232 tariffs on metals. And second, those earlier exclusions or exemptions some countries or products might have had under Section 232, many of those were later terminated.
Right, so the net tightened over time?
It did. It really tightened the overall impact.
So it's this kind of dual nature of the policy, the national security angle versus the trade deficit angle that makes it so complex to untangle, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's like trying to address two different sets of concerns with one sort of blunt instrument.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is this inherent protectionist duality. On one side, the clear goal was protecting and boosting U.S. industries.
Right.
But on the other side, these policies inevitably set off a chain reaction of global consequences. Even those products exempt from direct tariffs, like Nigerian and Angolan oil, they weren't entirely shielded. The overall global economic slowdown and the sort of dampened demand resulting from the broader trade tensions that led to significant drops in oil prices, which had a direct negative impact on those economies anyway. Think of it like your local bakery suffering because the whole town's cutting back spending, even if people still like your bread.
That makes perfect sense. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, consider how disproportionate the impact could be sometimes.
How so?
Well, a smaller economy like Lesotho, right? Despite having a vastly different economic scale and facing very different vulnerabilities compared to, say, China or the EU, it ended up facing the same maximum 50% tariff. The broad use of the trade deficit as the main yardstick didn't really account for those crucial nuances between economies.
And the messages coming from the White House about the likely impact often seemed very different from what independent economists were predicting, didn't they?
Exactly. The administration often downplayed potential price effects, suggesting minimal impact, while many external analyses forecasted the opposite, higher prices for American consumers and businesses, and a drag on overall U.S. economic growth. That divergence really underscores the contested nature and maybe even the inherent contradictions within the policy framework itself.
Let's take a quick look at this table you've put together. U.S. tariff rates applied to key African economies. It really does illustrate the varying impacts. Lesotho at 50% on apparel and textiles.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
For an economy so reliant on that sector, that must have been a massive blow.
It was potentially devastating. Apparel and textiles form the very backbone of Lesotho's economy. A 50% tariff basically threatened their primary export sector's existence in the U.S. market.
And then South Africa, facing those 31% general tariffs, plus the Section 232 duties on metals in the auto industry, That's a complex hit.
For a major industrial player like South Africa, yeah, these combined tariffs hit key export areas really hard. Metals, automobiles, these are significant contributors to their economy, and the duties substantially increase their costs selling into the U.S.
Then you've got Nigeria at 14% on non-oil exports. So while their main export, oil, was exempt from the reciprocal tariffs, their efforts to diversify away from oil were directly hindered.
Precisely. It created a significant obstacle. It made those non-oil goods less competitive in the U.S. market, especially after they'd previously enjoyed duty-free access under AGOA, a real challenge for diversification.
And Kenya at 10% on apparel and agriculture, given how much they relied on AGOA for those sectors, that must have been a really significant shift from near zero.
It was a direct challenge to their competitiveness. These were sectors that had really flourished under AGOA's duty-free access, so a 10% tariff could potentially impact livelihoods and future growth quite significantly.
Okay, so these tariffs weren't just abstract numbers on a page. They had very real and very distinct consequences across the continent.
Absolutely. The table clearly shows that variation to different levels of exposure, different sectors feeling the most pressure depending on the country.
Now let's zoom out just a bit and talk more about AGO itself. This has been, as you said, a cornerstone of the U.S.-Africa economic relationship for over 2 decades. Can you remind us quickly of its core purpose?
Sure. AGO started back in 2000, basically provided eligible sub-Saharan African countries with non-reciprocal duty-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of products.
Right. Non-reciprocal meaning they didn't have to lower their own tariffs in return.
Exactly. The main goals were really to encourage industrial growth, create jobs, and promote economic diversification beyond just raw materials, with a particular focus often on sectors like textiles, clothing, and agriculture.
And it had some real successes, didn't it? You mentioned Kenya earlier.
Indeed. It's estimated AGO helped generate something like 66,000 jobs in Kenya alone, particularly in the apparel industry. It was a tangible example of how trade preferences could stimulate economic activity.
So how did Trump's reciprocal tariffs fit into this AGO picture then? It sounds like they were on a direct collision course.
They absolutely were. The introduction of these new tariffs directly challenged, and in many cases effectively canceled out the duty-free advantages AGOA had provided for years.
So like in Kenya's case?
Exactly. Suddenly facing a 10% baseline tariff on apparel and agricultural goods that had previously entered the U.S. duty-free. That significantly weakened their competitive position overnight. So yeah, the new tariff directly negated the AGOA benefit for those key exports.
And for a country like Lesotho, which we just discussed, facing that massive 50% tariff on its crucial textile industry.
Well, that level of tariff represented an almost existential threat. For an economy so heavily dependent on exporting textiles to the U.S. under AGOA, a 50% duty was widely seen as potentially a death knell for that entire industry.
It's quite striking, isn't it, that there weren't specific carve-outs or exemptions created for AGOA products within this new tariff regime, especially when you compare it to how the USMCA treated Canada and Mexico.
It is striking, and it really signaled a shift in priorities.
Yeah.
The absence of specific exemptions for AGOA beneficiary countries indicated that, while the new tariff system took precedence over those existing preferential trade arrangements, it highlighted the potential fragility of agreements like AGOA when faced with unilateral policy changes.
And then there's the timing of all this. AGOA itself was up for renewal in September 2025. The uncertainty these tariffs created must have been a major headache for businesses trying to plan long-term.
Oh, absolutely. Businesses make investment and supply chain decisions, 12, 18 months, sometimes longer, into the future.
Right.
The uncertainty surrounding both the tariffs themselves and the renewal of AGO created a huge barrier for companies considering long-term commitments in Africa. It really deterred crucial foreign direct investment.
So it wasn't just about the immediate increase in costs. It had these significant knock-on effects on investment and strategic planning.
Precisely. Undermining AGOA had these broader implications. It directly contradicted decades of U.S. foreign policy aimed at fostering development and stability in Africa through trade partnerships. And it risked weakening U.S. soft power and diplomatic ties, potentially at a time when other global powers, like China and Russia, were actively increasing their engagement on the continent.
It sounds like it undermined the very foundation of that trade, not aid approach that the U.S. had often promoted for Africa.
That's a key paradox, isn't it? By imposing these trade barriers, the U.S. risked creating what some called an aid and trade vacuum.
How so?
Well, particularly for fragile states that relied on both trade opportunities and development assistance. If trade gets harder, They might become more dependent on aid, potentially increasing the need for humanitarian assistance in the long run. Kind of a counterintuitive outcome for a policy perhaps aimed at fostering self-reliance.
You mentioned Kenya's former UN ambassador, Martin Kimani, talking about the importance of the predictability premium. That really resonates.
It does. He very astutely pointed out that the uncertainty around AGOA's future and these tariffs was incredibly damaging. Predictability in trade rules is just fundamental for attracting investment and fostering growth.
If the rules keep changing.
Exactly. How can businesses plan and invest effectively? These policy shifts directly eroded that crucial predictability.
Let's delve deeper into some of those key African economies again and look at the specific direct economic impacts. Starting with South Africa, a major industrial center.
Right. South Africa, as a significant exporter of steel and aluminum, was directly hit by the Section 232 tariffs. We know 25% on steel, eventually 25% on aluminum too. That undoubtedly increased the cost of their metal exports to the U.S., which were substantial, about $1.44 billion back in 2021, including a lot of unwrought aluminum.
And their automotive sector is also a major exporter to the U.S., right? A big AGOA user too.
Absolutely. Over $2 billion in annual exports of vehicles and parts to the U.S. Cars alone were like 64% of their AGOA exports in 2024. So that 25% potential auto tariff, on top of the general 30-31% reciprocal tariffs, posed a really significant threat.
Even if the U.S. wasn't their biggest overall auto market.
Even so. The potential job losses were estimated at maybe 5-10% of the industry's workforce. That's a major concern for an economy like South Africa's.
But South Africa didn't just, stand by, did they? They responded.
No, they showed resilience. They actually managed export growth in some of those years, and they actively pursued strategic responses, investing in the impacted industries, really pushing diversification through things like the AfCFTA, and engaging diplomatically, seeking exemptions, quotas, maybe bilateral deals with the U.S.
But no retaliation.
Notably, no retaliatory tariffs. They focused on negotiation and adaptation.
Okay, let's switch to Nigeria. A very different economy, obviously, heavily reliant on oil.
Nigeria faced a 14% general reciprocal tariff. But crucially, their main exports, crude oil, minerals, were exempt from those tariffs.
But as we discussed,
they weren't immune. The global oil price slump, triggered partly by fears of a wider trade war, significantly hit their revenue. Nigeria's finance minister, Wale Eden, specifically acknowledged this oil price effect.
So even with the direct exemption for oil, the indirect consequences were substantial for their budget.
Precisely. And remember that 14% tariff on their non-oil exports? Those are vital for their diversification efforts.
Right.
It made it harder for them to reduce their oil dependence. Goods that previously had duty-free AGO access suddenly became less competitive. It really highlights Nigeria's diversification dilemma, as you might call it.
Yeah, the tariffs made it harder to achieve that goal. What about Kenya, then, with its significant apparel and agricultural sectors?
Kenya faced that 10% baseline tariff. That's a big jump from the near-zero rates they enjoyed under AGOA for key exports like apparel and textiles.
And those are big sectors for them.
Huge. Total AGOA exports were around $510 million in 2023. Apparel alone, nearly $550 million in 2024. So that 10% tariff directly threatened their competitiveness, and importantly, those estimated 66,000 AGOA-related jobs. We heard concerns from factories like United Aryan about the real-world impact on employment.
And their response was quite proactive, wasn't it? Trying to secure their future access.
Yes, very. Kenya actively appealed the tariff imposition, and they made a strategic decision to pursue a bilateral free trade agreement, an FTA, with the U.S. really aiming for that long-term certainty and better trade terms.
You've also highlighted several other economies that felt significant impacts. Lesotho, obviously, with that 50% on textiles. Madagascar and Mauritius facing high tariffs on their apparel industries. Angola, vulnerable to the oil price drops despite the exemption. It really paints a picture of widespread disruption, doesn't it?
It really does. Each country faced a unique set of challenges depending on its specific export mix and how much it relied on the U.S. market. Algeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Egypt, Morocco. They also experienced notable impacts.
Though some had mitigating factors.
Right, some, like Egypt with its qualifying industrial zones, QIZ, or Morocco with its existing FTA with the U.S., had certain buffers or even potential relative advantages in specific sectors compared to others facing higher tariffs.
That oil paradox you mentioned for Nigeria and Angola is such an interesting point. Exempt from direct tariffs, but still getting hit hard by the global price declines caused by the trade tensions.
It really just underscores the deep interconnectedness of the global economy, doesn't it? Even specific sector exemptions can't fully insulate countries from these broader macroeconomic waves kicked up by trade policy.
In Nigeria's diversification dilemma, the tariffs making it harder to move away from oil dependence, that's a real long-term strategic challenge for them.
It is. It added another significant layer of difficulty to their efforts to build a more diverse and, frankly, more resilient economic base for the future.
But then you also point out this potential competitive advantage shift for countries like Egypt and possibly Morocco. Their existing trade deals or lower tariff rates might have actually given them a slight edge against competitors, maybe Asian competitors, facing higher duties.
Exactly. While the overall impact on African economies was largely negative, the uneven application of the tariffs did create some perhaps unexpected shifts in competitive dynamics between exporting nations.
This table summarizing the impact on key export sectors really brings home the diverse effects across the continent, doesn't it? From South Africa's metals and autos to Nigeria's non-oil push and Kenya's apparel, the sectors feeling the pain were varied and significant.
Yeah, it provides a clear snapshot, I think, of the tangible consequences in critical industries across several major African economies.
So looming out even further now, what were some of the broader macroeconomic consequences for the entire African continent? It wasn't just about individual countries' exports falling, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. The tariffs contributed to global inflationary pressures. As the cost of imported goods rose worldwide, that directly reduced the purchasing power of consumers and businesses across Africa.
The global contagion effect.
Exactly. A clear example of that. Think of it like your own grocery bill suddenly jumping even though you're buying the same stuff. That's a direct impact of these increased costs getting passed along.
And it led to an overall dampening of global trade, which must have had a significant ripple effect.
Precisely. Reduced global trade inevitably meant slower economic growth worldwide. And that affected African nations' ability both to export their own goods and also to afford essential imports from the U.S. and elsewhere.
You also mentioned a chilling effect on investment earlier.
Yes, the sheer uncertainty created by the tariffs, the disruption to establish market access, it definitely deterred foreign direct investment. And it even impacted remittance flows in some cases, a real investment chill.
Right.
Plus, the whole Buy American push also raised concerns about potential future limits on U.S. investment flowing into Africa, maybe in key sectors like high-tech.
And the potential for job losses was widespread, you said, particularly in those export-focused sectors we've discussed, textiles, autos.
Yeah, the warnings from groups like ITUC Africa about potential rises in poverty, even what they termed hunger and misery, really underscore the severe human cost these economic disruptions could have.
That's stark.
Production cuts in key industries threaten livelihoods across several countries.
It even sounds like there were potential knock-on effects for U.S. foreign aid programs.
Indeed. The broader policy shifts, the America First stance, raised concerns about the long-term sustainability of U.S. aid commitments. There were worries about potential risks to crucial programs like USAID, even PEPFAR, which has been vital in combating AIDS.
So cuts there would leave vulnerable economies even more exposed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any reduction in aid would hit already struggling economies hard.
So the combined effect of these trade barriers, potential aid reductions, and the general economic slowdown painted a really concerning picture for development progress.
The risk of a development reversal was very real. It potentially threatened to undo decades of progress that had been linked, in part, to initiatives like AGOA. The concerns voiced by labor groups highlighted the potential for increased hardship and a setback to long-term development goals across the continent.
Faced with all of this, how did African nations respond? They weren't just passive observers, presumably.
No, definitely not. African nations adopted a really multifaceted approach. Diplomatic engagement was key. You saw countries like Kenya actively appealing the tariffs and also pursuing new trade deals, like trying for that bilateral FTA, with the U.S. aiming to be the second African nation after Morocco with one.
Right.
South Africa engaged in bilateral talks, seeking exemptions, quotas, really emphasizing the mutual benefits of their trade relationship. Lesotho planned high-level trade talks specifically about its extremely high tariff rate.
There are broader calls, too.
Yes, calls for African leaders to collectively advocate for new preferential arrangements, maybe highlighting Africa's crucial role in supplying critical minerals, something clearly in the U.S.'s national interest, maybe similar to how the USMCA addressed supply chains.
So they were actively trying to navigate this new, more difficult trade landscape.
Exactly. And crucially, there was a strong, renewed emphasis placed on accelerating intra-African trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA.
Ah, interesting.
The external pressure from the U.S. tariffs actually underscored the importance of building a stronger internal African market as a buffer against these kinds of global trade shocks.
So the AfCFTA became like a huge umbrella, as some put it.
That was the idea, offering protection against external trade headwinds. There were urgent calls for faster ratification of the AfCFTA, better coordination among regional trade bodies to attract investment hubs within the continent.
So kind of a situation where necessity drove innovation and a renewed focus on regional solutions?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It definitely highlighted the vulnerability of being too reliant on external preferences and spurred a renewed focus on building greater continental self-reliance.
What else? Diversification.
Big time. Diversification of export markets became a priority, actively looking beyond the U.S. to partners like China, the EU, the BRICS nations, just to build greater resilience. And also diversification of products, focusing more on transitioning from exporting raw materials to higher value finished goods, like moving from cocoa beans to actual chocolate production.
And strengthening their own domestic industries, too.
Absolutely. That was another key pillar. Implementing policies for import substitution where feasible, building domestic industrial capacity, making strategic investments in infrastructure, focusing on capacity building, policy reforms to cut red tape, those non-tariff barriers.
Right.
And providing targeted support, like tax relief or export incentives, to those sectors hit hardest by the tariffs.
It sounds like there was a growing call for a more unified African voice on these trade matters.
Precisely. A real push for a more coordinated continental response. The African Union, AU, was seen as needing to play a central role in advocating for a more self-reliant, maybe an Africa-first trade policy.
Okay.
There was even a suggestion floated for an extraordinary meeting of trade and industry ministers from across the continent to develop a joint Africa-first approach.
But not focused on retaliation.
Interestingly, no. The general advice seemed to be against retaliatory tariffs, with a greater emphasis on pursuing opportunities and maintaining an open trading environment where possible.
You also mentioned the strategic value of Africa's critical mineral resources. That sounds like a potential point of leverage.
It is. Recognizing their significant endowments of minerals vital for, green tech, electronics. African nations started to see this as a potential negotiating tool.
How so?
For securing more favorable, more stable access to the U.S. market, framing it in terms of the U.S.'s own supply chain security and national interests. Given that at least 24 African countries rely heavily on mining for many, it's over 75% of export earnings.
Wow.
This represents a potentially significant bargaining chip for ensuring more predictable trade relationships.
This table summarizing the African government's strategic responses really highlights how proactive they were trying to be: diplomacy, regional trade, domestic focus.
It really underscores the diverse and strategic ways African nations sought to adapt to the significant challenges the U.S. tariffs threw at them. It wasn't just one response, it was many, tailored to different situations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's crystal clear these tariffs caused profound disruption and, maybe just as importantly, unpredictability for African economies.
They absolutely did. The key direct effects were pretty stark. Increased costs for exports, the effect of cancellation of many hard-won AGOA benefits, reduced competitiveness in a key market, revenue losses, and very real threats to jobs in crucial sectors like textiles, apparel, and autos.
And the impacts, as we've discussed, went well beyond just those direct trade effects.
Absolutely. We saw those broader consequences, the increased uncertainty hanging over global trade, the volatility in commodity prices, especially oil, the chill on investment, and even potential negative impacts spilling over into U.S. foreign aid programs.
It certainly seems to have put a significant strain on the long-term trade relationship between the U.S. and Africa, and it definitely raised questions about the reliability of preferential trade agreements like AGOA.
It really challenged the established norms, didn't it?
Wow.
And it forced African nations to seriously reevaluate their reliance on the U.S. market as maybe the primary engine for their economic growth.
But it wasn't entirely negative, was it? You pointed out one potential, perhaps unintended, positive outcome?
Indeed. It seems the tariffs acted as something of a catalyst. They definitely accelerated the momentum behind the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, and prompted a much greater emphasis across the continent on diversifying export markets and building stronger internal economic resilience, a push towards self-reliance.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you, our listener, with. How will this period of really significant trade upheaval ultimately reshape the economic relationships between Africa and the rest of the world? And perhaps just as importantly, what does Africa's increased focus on self-reliance and regional integration actually mean for global trade dynamics in the coming years? It really compels you to consider the long-term strategic implications, not just for African nations themselves, but for overall global economic stability.